Hey, welcome everybody to this Edge of Mind podcast, where it is really an incredible honor and delight to introduce one of the greatest minds on the planet, a person I'm happy to call a dear friend, and someone I just cannot wait to talk about in terms of his brand new book, Ken Wilber. So I'm going to read an abbreviated biography of Ken, and we're just going to dive right in. So Ken Wilber is a developer of an integral theory of everything that embraces the truths of all the great world's spiritual, scientific, and philosophical traditions. He is the most widely translated academic writer in America, with 25 books translated into some 30 foreign languages. Ken is also the founder of the Integral Institute, which is the first organization fully dedicated to advancement and application of the integral approach in relation to contemporary global issues. He's worked in collaboration with over 200 scholars and experts specializing in education, politics, business, medicine, psychology, spirituality, as well as law and criminal justice. In 2007, Ken co-founded The Integral Life, a social media hub dedicated to sharing the integral vision with the worldwide community, as well as documenting and catalyzing the progress of the integral movement. So, dear friend, I have been looking forward to this for so long. This book that we're going to be talking about, Finding Radical Wholeness, the Integral Path to Unity, Growth, and Delight, is nothing short of remarkable. So it's so fun to be able to spend this time with you. I can't tell you.
Terrific. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here.
Yeah, it's just great. So here's what I'm thinking. It's almost like an embarrassment of riches. This book has so many treasures in it that and there's so many outside of some of the granular issues I want to discuss with you. With your permission, this is kind of what I'm planning on doing for our time together. Is maybe
Okay.
the first part of our conversation we'll be diving into the really the genius of this book, the guts of the book. And then because you're just so uniquely situated to talk about things from the 50,000 foot perspective, I mean, perspectives is really what your life has been about. I want to back off maybe for the second half and talk about some really big global issues. Not that the first part won't be connected to that. They're obviously inextricably connected. But
Sure.
with your permission, this is kind of the idea I had in mind to join a little bit of heaven and earth
Okay.
to really bring everything together. So maybe to get things going here, as the author of 25 books, what was your intention, your aspiration in writing this one?
Well, I've written several books, obviously. And what I wanted to do here was sort of summarize the overall integral view that I've developed over these 25, actually 35 books. Um, and so I go through the idea of wholeness and how most people want to be whole or holistic, however we want to term it. Um, but there are actually several different meanings to the word wholeness. There's waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up. And each one of those gives us a different type of wholeness. They're very real wholes, but they're different types of wholes. So I wanted to go through all of those and point out what each different type of whole offers us and point out several different exercises or practices that you can take up yourself to actually get in touch with that type of wholeness, and then talk about how they all come together to give us a sort of a big wholeness or a complete wholeness. And so that was the aim of the book, basically, was to give that sort of overview.
Yeah, it's remarkable. As you know, I've been a dear, avid fan of yours ever since Spectrum of Consciousness was published when you were 23 years old. So I have read every single book that you have
Right.
published, the entire Ken Wilber bookshelf, which is just so fun. And this one was just such a wonderful, like you say, a wonderful condensation, summary, distillation of just this massive corpus that you've put together with some really original, innovative stuff that I have not seen in some of your other books that I want to get to in a second. But here's one thing that I find so I wouldn't say perplexing, but interesting, is on one level, when I read something like this, it is so inspiring. There's just so much here. On another level, it's intimidating as hell. It's almost daunting because it really points out the extraordinary complexity of the human condition and how easy it is to shrink wrap in all these subtle and gross reductionist ways. Our little favorite scenario and package that, my little thingy will do it for you, my little whatever is going to do it for you. And with your kind of Aristotelian Hegelian way, you have the ability to see it from a much, much larger perspective. So how does somebody relate to this? On one level, I had to chuckle when I got towards the end of the book. It was like, holy wow, man, there's just so much inner work I need to do, right? So maybe talk to us a little bit about the delicate, I wouldn't say delicate, just the dance, the play of being inspired by this extraordinary level of articulation and the complexity of the human condition and all these vectors of transformation, and how not to let that slip into the near enemy of intimidation.
Right. Well, you're right that in a certain way of looking at it, it's fairly complex, because we do have waking up, growing up, opening up, cleaning up, and showing up. And each of those refers to a different type of wholeness that a human being has fully available to them. So waking up is the traditional enlightenment or awakening, Buddhist, Hindu, Christian, mystical. It's the basic mystical traditions found the world over. And they're, of course, in a certain sense, a really big type of wholeness because they claim to unite the individual self with the entire universe, with Godhead, Allah, Brahman, Buddha nature, and the entire rest of the universe. So that's a complex enough issue. And it's, on the one hand, it's fairly difficult to have a waking up experience. But there are many, many traditions the world over that are devoted exclusively to that sort of experience. Zen Buddhism is a typical example. And Zen Buddhism is built around the experience that they call Satori. And Satori is a radical unity awareness. It's a unity of yourself with the entire universe. And so Zen Buddhism has many different techniques that you can use and follow to have a Satori experience. But the interesting thing about Satori is that even though it's a oneness with sort of the entire universe, there are several other types of wholeness that it doesn't include. And some of these types of wholenesses are fairly difficult to recognize. And some of them are so different, they were only discovered about 100 years ago. So growing up and cleaning up are really only around 100 years old. And they are profound types of waking or becoming one with the area that they cover. So growing up, for example, most people don't know that every single human being goes through a specific set of levels or stages of growth and development. So they there are around generally 6 to 8 major stages that are given that human beings grow and develop through. Gene Gebser called them the archaic stage, the magic stage, the mythic stage, the rationalist stage, the pluralistic stage, and the integrated or integral stage. And so when you start out and you're just born, you're at a so-called archaic stage, which is, for example, during the first 4 to 6 months of life, the infant can't even tell the difference between where its body stops and the chair starts.
Ken, I'm going to say there's one thing we have to say right here, if you don't mind me interrupting you,
Sure.
because you interject something right here that is so important. So I want you to run on this before you go to the magic stage, and that is the really central difference between a-duality and non-duality, which
Sure.
then gets completely conflated in what you talk about so beautifully as the pre-trans fallacy. This is a big deal because a lot of people really conflate the trans with the pre, atypical with a-dual with non-dual.
Yes, the entire romantic movement is based on just that confusion. Because what they do is they look at an infant and they see that it cannot tell the difference between inside and outside. And so they simply assume, oh, the infant is one with everything. But if you look at the Christian Great Chain of Being, which is their shortened version of the major stages of development, it goes from material or physical level to the living body level to mind to soul to spirit. So the infant is only one with the material level. It's not yet one with the body or the mind or the soul or the spirit. Those haven't even emerged for a 4-month-old infant. But because it's lost in a type of fusion state, almost all philosophers look at that fusion state as if it's the same as a ultimate unity awareness. And it's not at all. And that's a really important and crucial item. Um, when I did so-called Wilber 1, or my first version, which was presented in the spectrum of consciousness, somehow I managed to avoid doing that. Although I still, when I had to go through all my written work to produce my collected works, which Shambhala brought out several years ago, um, as I reread the spectrum of consciousness, it's every point that I would come to, I was just shocked that I didn't actually make that confusion. And I'd actually just step around it. Because I know in sort of the back of my mind, I had a kind of generic agreement with it. And certainly all of the people that I really looked up to, from Aldous Huxley to Alan Watts, that were writing books about this, they all made that confusion. They all made what I call the retro-romantic confusion, which is confusing that early romantic fusion state with the ultimate enlightened state of oneness, or sort of a total wholeness. And it's just not true at all. But to confuse the pre-rational fusion with the trans-rational enlightenment or satori is just to get the complete ultimate ends of the spectrum of consciousness totally confused and misidentified. And that's just a disaster.
Totally.
So that's
It's it's a big problem these days, Ken, because you may be aware, and I want to come back to this a little bit later. Really unpack this is the there's a lot of traffic with the whole neo non-duality movement, right? It's incredibly, I won't name names, but we know the people. They're wonderful people. They're doing some amazing things. But OMG, the
yeah.
stuff that is left out in this kind of absolutistic approach of going all the way to that, it's borderline shocking to me.
Yeah, it really is, especially when you see the whole spectrum of development and how it unfolds. It's shocking that the very alpha and the ultimate omega points are just slammed together. And then you have the growth of the intermediate stages, like the ego and the self and all. They have to be interpreted as somehow destroying this ultimate unity state, whereas they're actually just emerging and growing and expanding for the first time. And yet people have to say, oh, that's the fall. We were once whole, but we fell from Eden. And all world's mythologies tend to make that mistake. And certainly the Bible makes that mistake. And most Christianity makes that mistake. And it's just a horrible mistake, because we're not even following the path of growth and evolution and development. We're just confusing it with a regressive. It's a
What reminds me of, Ken, is the Greek word for sin, as you know, is hamartia. It's an archery term to miss the mark. And it's like, well, no kidding that we're missing the mark, because in the retro-romantic fusion pathology,
right.
your aim is just a wee bit off, like 180 degrees.
Right.
And so it couldn't be farther off the mark. And then you wonder why people get stuck and tripped up, because their aim is literally 180 degrees off the target.
Yeah, it's true. And what is happening as we go through development is that the mind is starting to develop. And so it's starting to make distinctions between inside and outside, and between all of the relative opposites that mark the relative world. But understanding that those are there and that they need to be transcended and brought together, that's a whole part, an important part of growing up. And it's a crucial part of waking up. But when we just confuse it and say, oh, well, all those divisions are just forcing divisions that we didn't have at the beginning. We were once whole. We once were in the state of Eden. We once were one with everything. And we just grew up and blasted it all to hell. And that's just a completely confused and desperately wrong way to look at what actually is a true growth and a genuine evolution. I mean, if that were true, why did evolution turn around and start going backwards? Why did why did we sort of learn to separate our organism from our environment? And then the next step, we mushed them back together and just introduced a division that wasn't there. And that's just completely crazy. Evolution doesn't run backward, and it doesn't force divisions that aren't there. They're there in the relative world, and we have to be aware of that. But that's the retro-romantic fallacy.
That's a massive one. And so, Ken, let me ask you, I want to invite you to continue on the extraordinary kind of journey of balancing waking up and growing up. And also maybe if there was one of the ups that was most important. And again, that's it's kind of a facile question. I think you understand as well. The whole point is there isn't just one. But let's just say the most important one. To me, it would seem to be, and I think you intimate this, it really would seem to be that the waking up vector is arguably the most important. And I want to emphasize this a little bit for a number of reasons that you're suggesting. One is that there can be this, and I see this in the communities that I roll, this kind of somewhat dismissive, facile, my languaging, kind of trickle down spirituality, trickle down effect, that if you just get the state thing going, everything else, Reaganomics trickle down, everything else is going to follow in line, and it's just going to all be love and light. Well, it doesn't seem to work that way. And the reason I want to mention these is because understanding this is going to prevent a heap of hurt with all the endless, interminable scandals, the sex abuse things, the power abuse things. They really come down to the ability, the centrality of articulating the difference between waking up and growing up. They're not the same properties of growth and evolution. So run with that a little bit, because not only is this philosophically interesting, so to speak. And here's the other thing about your work. On one level, people say, oh, Ken Wilber, you're so philosophical. And I go, well, wait a second. I don't think so. I think it may be philosophical to you simply because you haven't experienced it yet. It's not theoretical. It's not philosophical. It's descriptive. It's articulate. You may not have experienced it yet, hence it's theory to you, but this is a map laying out a territory that we're all eventually going to be traveling on. So I think that's also really important to throw into the works.
Yeah, it is. And it's true that most people don't have a deep understanding of waking up. Now, interestingly, most people, polls show 60% of Americans have had one experience of being one with everything. So that's a fairly large number that have had at least one minor waking up experience. But very few people complete that pathway and fully and completely wake up and remain one with everything. That's very rare. And because that's very rare, almost everybody says, oh, God is ineffable. The ultimate reality can't be described in words. Well, if we all had direct, immediate, and long lasting waking up experiences, we'd have words for it. I mean, Zen masters, for example, talk about emptiness all the time. That's all they're talking about because they have a continued deep experience of waking up. And so they create thousands of koans that describe waking up. And they're usually not rational descriptions. Like one koan is, what's the sound of one hand clapping? Or another koan is, without hurting the goose, get the goose out of a bottle. The most common koan is called Joshu's Mu. And any Buddhist knows that every sentient being has a Buddha nature. Dogs have Buddha nature, trees have Buddha nature, cats have Buddha nature, deers, worms, all of them have Buddha nature. So it's the Zen koan is a student asked Joshu, Joshu was a very famous Japanese Zen master, does a dog have a Buddha nature? And as I say, every Buddhist knows the correct answer to that is yes. And Joshu just said real loudly, mu. Mu is Japanese for no. So why did he say no? That's the koan that you have to figure out. But Zen masters are talking these things all the time, and they don't find it ineffable at all. So our ineffability is simply our lack of direct experience in the frequent way. Because if we did, we'd think of terms for it, but we don't. So that's a little bit of a problem. But that waking up is having a direct and immediate understanding that you are one with the entire universe. And growing up is the number of stages that we actually go through. So when we're born, for example, we don't have access to language, we can't speak, we don't know mathematics, we don't know logic. All of those emerge and grow up in terms of stages. And at each stage, we tend to add another perspective. So first person perspective is the perspective of the person speaking. So first person pronoun is I, we, I, me, mine, and so on. A second person perspective is the perspective of the person being spoken to. So that's a you or thou or thine. And so we first learn a first person perspective, then we learn a second person perspective. And a third person perspective is the perspective of the thing or person being spoken about. So the person speaking is an I or me, person spoken to is a you or thine, and the person spoken about is a he or a she or they or them or it or its. And so those grow and emerge stage by stage. So those stages of growing up are what we mean by growing up. And as I say, people like Gene Gebser have found 6 major stages that they go through. And most developmental psychologists, and there are dozens of them, have found between 6 and 8 major stages that we grow through. And Gebser's, again, are archaic to magic to mythic to rational to pluralistic to integral. And when I first understood the difference between waking up and growing up, that was a big, important understanding for me. Because when I was around 13 or so, I stumbled upon developmental psychology, and I started studying all the different major developmental psychologists. Each of them, most psychologists agree that human beings don't have just one intelligence, which we call cognitive intelligence and is measured by the all-important IQ test. We actually have what they call multiple intelligences. So we have cognitive intelligence. We also have emotional intelligence, moral intelligence, spiritual intelligence, aesthetic intelligence, or the capacity to see beauty, as in the good, the true, and the beautiful. And spatial intelligence and verbal intelligence. And most psychologists maintain we have between 8 and 12 multiple intelligences. And each of the major developmental psychologists focused on just studying one major intelligence. Whether they knew they were focusing on just one or not is open to debate, but they ended up focusing on one basic intelligence. So Piaget studied cognitive intelligence, and Kohlberg studied moral intelligence, and Loevinger studied ego development or ego intelligence, and so on. So it was a big discovery for me to learn that all of these different multiple intelligences, although they were all different lines of development, they all went through the same basic 6 to 8 stages of development. So there were different lines, same levels of development. And when I put together my version of what these 6 to 8 levels were, because they were all essentially similar, but people gave them different names. Like if you were studying Piaget's cognitive intelligence, you gave the names cognitive names. So they were called pre-operational intelligence, concrete operational intelligence, formal operational intelligence, systemic intelligence, and so on. And Jane Loevinger, who was studying ego development, would name the same lines, but she would name them like selfish stage, and then a care stage, and then a universal care stage, and so on, and then an integrated stage. So that just blew me away that all of these different developmental psychologists had all hit upon the same 6 to 8 or so basic levels of development. So we all have these very similar stages that we go through in whatever multiple intelligence we're developing. And then I also, right around 13, I had my first spontaneous mystical experience. So I was one of the 60% of Americans that had had at least one experience of oneness with everything. And so I immediately went out and found a Zen master and started studying Zen and would go on to have several more Satori's. But while I was studying Zen, I noticed these things called the 10 Zen ox herding pictures. And they're basically 10 pictures of the 10 major stages of development that people go through in Zen on their way to a full enlightenment. And so I saw these 10 stages, and of course, I had my 6 to 8 or 9 stages of development. And I thought, wow, even Zen's got these stages of development. And that just blew me away. So the 10 Zen ox herding pictures were just versions of these 6 to 8 major stages of development that everybody went through. And my learning the difference between these growing up stages and the waking up stages was really a huge development for me. And it was a big discovery because almost all of the world's mystical traditions did indeed go through the 10 Zen ox herding picture stages, but not one of them were aware of the stages of growing up. They just had no idea. And that's really important because psychologists have learned that no matter what experience you have, whether it's a waking up experience or any other experience, it will be interpreted to the stage of growing up that you're at. And the fact that no religion worldwide knew anything about these growing up stages just floored me. This is why, by the way, almost all waking up stages are 10 or 20,000 years old. They were discovered way back in our history because they're direct first person immediate experiences. All waking up experiences, when you have a waking up experience, if you're sitting in the woods and you're meditating, and all of a sudden you're one with everything and drenched in love and bliss, you know it. You are right. I am covered in love and bliss, and I'm one with everything. That's a first person experience. And first person, remember, is defined as the person who is speaking or who has the experience. It's an immediate, direct experience. But nobody, at no matter what stage of growing up they're at, nobody knows they're having a growing up state experience, a stage experience, or we call them a structure stage, because waking up experiences are first person states of consciousness, and growing up structures are third person structures of consciousness. So nobody has having at a particular growing up stage knows what stage they're at. They don't remember transitioning from the previous stage they were at, and they don't know that they yet probably have several more stages of growing up that they can go through. So this was just huge for me to understand that, wait, we have waking up first person experiences, and all the world's mystical traditions are aware of those first person experiences because they're all direct, immediate, aware experiences that they're having. But not one of them knows about the growing up stage that they're at. And so religions like Christianity and most of the world's great religions are stuck at the mythic stage of development and the archaic, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, integral stages of development. Many of the world's great religions are stuck at the mythic stage. And developmentalists often call the mythic stage of development the mythic literal stage, because they all take their myths to be literally true. So all of the Bible, for example, is just full of miracles and magic and mythic realities. All of them are maintained to be literally true, and they're not. They're just myths. They're as real as the tooth fairy or Santa Claus or any other mythic creature.
Yeah.
So that was a really big understanding for me. And it allowed me to go back and look at history as an unfolding in these evolutionary or growing up stages of development. But humanity wasn't aware of this. And yet, in the first 100 or so thousand years that we were around, we were at an archaic stage. And then, starting around 50,000 years BC, we moved into a magic stage. And the magic stage was generally the stage of the earliest tribal cultures that we have. Um, and um, magic is because the mind starts out one with its environment, it eventually learns to differentiate what it thinks from what is thought. So magic is the first separation between a subjective state and an objective state. Um, and magic is when that differentiation is still poorly made and it isn't very clear, the mind thinks that to change a signifier or the word representing a thing, like the word tree, is not separated very well from the real tree. And so the mind thinks that to alter or change the word tree is to change the real tree magically. And that's where all magic comes from, is we think that we can change the signifier and it changes the signified magically.
Right.
Um,
Right.
and then beyond magic is mythic, and that's where human beings lose the capacity to do magic. But supernatural beings can perform magic, and those are all of our myths. So Zeus, Apollo, Jehovah, Yahweh, etc. Those are all mythic figures, and all of them can perform magic. And so, if we know how to approach them correctly in prayer or through sacrifice or some other very appropriate, honoring approach, then we can talk those supernatural beings into performing magic on our behalf. So we can pray to the earth goddess and she'll make the crops grow, or we can pray for rain. And if we pray really sincerely and intensely, God will make it rain for us. Or if we're sick and we pray to some god or goddess, they can make us better. And so that's the mythic stage. And that started to emerge right around 10,000 BCE. And most of the world's religions that we still have were came into being starting around 10,000 BCE and coming to particular fruition starting around 6,000 BCE. Um, and that includes all of the Bible, for example. And so I could track the evolution of humanity through archaic, magic, mythic, then rational, particularly with the Western Enlightenment, and then pluralistic with the beginning of the postmodern era. Pluralistic is also called multicultural stage of development. And when humanity moved into that stage, we came into today's present postmodern era of wokeism and all of that. And we still have an integral stage that we can grow through. And of course, very advanced people alive now are at an integral stage.
Right.
Um,
Kim,
and
if you don't mind me interjecting, I think what I want to really put an exclamation point mark exclamation mark on here is that you suggested it, but I want to really stamp it, is that the importance again as we go up these stages is that a person can have a completely legitimate opening experience. I would actually say, and I think you would probably agree with me, that what we call a mystical experience is an experience of opening. You're basically relaxing more into the nature of things. But then because we don't look at these structures, we look through them, they become the archetypal filters and the blind spots. And so then,
Right.
correct me if I'm wrong, you have a legitimate experience of some spiritual insight, mystical state. But unless you remain in silence, unless you completely stay motionless, the minute you open your mouth, the minute you say or do anything, you actually have no choice but to express your realization through this particular structural level of development. And
That's right.
this is where the crap hits the fan, because you can have a pretty highfalutin state thing going on, but
Right.
you're down in a mythic level or whatever,
Right.
and oh boy, that's where the trouble starts.
That's right. And um, again, it comes from this notion of even though the person is interpreting their experience through their stage of growing up, magic, mythic, rational, pluralistic, or integral, they're not aware that they're interpreting through those stages. And as a matter of fact, they consciously think that this experience they had was ineffable. As we said, because we don't have that experience that often, we haven't developed a vocabulary for it. So they're just sort of talking about this experience because even though the experience could be completely itself wordless or without thought, as you say, as soon as they come out of that experience, they'll start thinking about it. They'll try to explain it. They'll try to make sense of it. They'll talk to themselves about it. They'll tell others about it, and they'll use words and explanation. And the words they're using are from whatever stage of growing up they're at. So if they're magic, they'll interpret it in maybe shamanic terms or magical terms or even voodoo terms. Voodoo is perfect magic religion because in voodoo, if you like make a doll that looks like a person and then you stick a pin in the doll, you'll actually hurt the person magically because what it represents, the thing and the thing itself, are not differentiated yet. And so we can magically make somebody sick if we stick pins in a doll that resembles them. Um, so that is a real problem. And Christianity came about during the mythic era of our development 6,000, 4,000, 2,000, 1,000 years BCE. And that's a real problem because most educated people stop identifying with myths.
Yeah.
They just realize they're all like the tooth fairy or Zeus or Apollo. They're just not real. And as Christianity went on and moved into the rational modern era, enormous number of people just stopped believing in a real God or in Jesus Christ or in any of the religious modes. As a matter of fact, the percentage of the people in Northern Europe who today believe anything about Christianity is 11%. That's it. We've had it with myths. We just don't believe them. And with good reason. They're not believable.
Yeah, it's a literal phase.
Yeah,
At the metaphorical phase, they have traction. So let me throw this two things. Let me throw it your way. When I'm looking over at these five vectors of
right.
waking up, growing up, etc., it seems to me, Ken, that on one level, in the spirit of your book, that when we talk about finding radical wholeness, correct me if I'm wrong, but would it be presumptuous to say that finding radical wholeness really applies more to five of those, four of those vectors, but not so much the waking up vector, because the waking up vector is more in the spirit of discovery. You're actually not finding it, you're revealing it, you're discovering it. I think this is somewhat important because the other four they do require some seeming effort. And please guide me if I'm wrong. There does seem to be some finding involved, but the other is the waking up, which may be the most important. I think it's more than just playing on words. It's not so much about finding as it is about discovering. And in fact, when that takes place, another last little interjection around languaging, I just thought about this when you're talking about the first person, second person, third person thing, and how critical that is in terms of perspective. Well, how about when you have a complete opening up experience? It's zero person. I mean, I understand the languaging behind first person, but what actually constitutes that level of non-duality is zero person perspective. That's what creates eternity.
Is it what?
Zero person perspective. In other words,
Um,
that's what actually creates, or actually not creates, but discloses that level of uh,
well,
transpersonal.
yeah, yes, you can do that. The reason I use first person perspective to describe a waking up experience is it's still the definition of first person is the person who is speaking.
Exactly. So that's more a playful glib. Yeah.
And so that's just that. And as for discovering versus finding,
Yeah.
or versus creating or building, or the reason I use um, all five as a discovery is all five of them are discovering realities that are already present.
Mhm.
So when you grow up from mythic to rational, the rational stage is present. It's already there. You're not making it up. You're finding it. You're discovering it. It's a real reality. And I wanted all of those, the objects of all five of those areas to be taken as real because they're real experiences. They're real realities. And unfortunately, in our scientific materialist world, they're all, if you discover anything that's interior, like your thought processes or your stage of growing up, any of those are taken to be just not really real, or at best they're called epiphenomena. So
Right.
your mind and your consciousness, that's just all epiphenomenal, which is scientific for not real. And I didn't want that to happen.
Yeah. That's
So,
fantastic. Well, let's
because
turn.
they're all very real and
Yeah.
they're all already present.
Wonderful. Really wonderful point of clarification. I want to talk to you a little bit about the chapter that I personally probably found the most delightful was the chapter on showing up.
Yeah,
I was like, wow, there are some major insights here. And so let's turn a little bit to that approach because one thing in particular that I'd like to question you about, to talk to us a little bit about, is this really creative, innovative way to look at matter. I'll let you run with it, but this wonderful radical expansion of our usual notions of matter is being, I love what you said. I can't remember when. I riff this all the time. Everything is the result of frisky dirt. I just love
yeah,
that language, right? It's all reducible to this like lifeless flatland thing. Well,
right.
in the showing up chapter, you talk about matter in such an original way. Talk to us a little bit about that distinction, that enhancement, because this is incredibly important because when people are on the spiritual path, we're on the spiritual path not merely in contradistinction to matter and materialism, but often in opposition to it. And
Right.
so that type of internal internecine warfare that gets broken down with this marvelous expansion of the whole notion of matter and materiality. So run with this one. I thought it was really great.
Sure. The point about matter as the ultimate constituent of the universe, um, in a certain sense, it's the ultimate foundation of the universe for sure. But Alfred North Whitehead and many of the world's, certainly of the West's greatest philosophers were all what's called panpsychists.
Right.
And I've never really liked that term because I maintain that all four quadrants, the I, the we, the it, and the its, go all the way up and all the way down. And that means that even a bit of dirt or matter has an I, and it joins together to form we's. And of course, it has those are its insides, its left-hand quadrants. And of course, it has right-hand quadrants, which are this mass and its energy, and it exists in time and space. And those are all present. And Whitehead, as one of many panpsychists, maintained that every bit of matter has a small initial grain of awareness or consciousness or feeling. And he called that prehension. And that's what prehension means. It's touching or feeling or grasping. And so starting with the smallest quarks and protons and neutrons, they all have a little bit of prehension. And that prehension will grow and evolve as the matter becomes bigger and more complex and more interwoven. So quarks come together to form protons and neutrons and electrons, and protons and neutrons and electrons come together to form atoms. And the prehension that an atom has is significantly greater than the prehension that a quark has. But it's still a prehension. It's still a little interior bit of consciousness or awareness or feeling. And atoms come together to form molecules, and they have even more prehension. Molecules come together to form a living cell, and living cell is often where prehension is thought to begin, but that's just not true, as we've seen with Whitehead. Prehension goes all the way back to the smallest bit of matter, because all matter has an inside and an outside. It doesn't even make sense to talk about the outside of an atom unless it also has an inside. I mean, what do you mean if you just say, oh, it's just got an outside?
It's almost like the one hand clapping koan, right? But now in
Right,
the world of science, but it doesn't float in the world of science, right?
right. So all these insides are coming together to form bigger outsides. And when they get really big, we can't miss the fact that their prehension has become quite significant. And so we start to notice it. So we notice that a worm has some sort of interior feeling or awareness. It's a very small amount of prehension, but it's a real, I mean, we recognize it moving and reacting to the world around it. And none of that makes sense unless there's an interior bit of awareness, an
But
interior bit
yeah,
of
if you don't want me interjecting now and again, because you're hitting on so many rich things here. So, so would this in fact be what exactly is the relationship, therefore, of prehension to consciousness? So at what point does prehension mature into consciousness? And as you know, one of the really big problems, three main ways of looking at reality, the materialistic way, the panpsychist way, and the idealistic way, each one has its own kind of issue around understanding consciousness, the hard problem, the combination problem, and the decombination problem. So here, two things. When does prehension turn into consciousness, the relationship between those two? And how does this view deal with the combination problem? Because this is exactly where you're going. And I don't mean to take you off track, but I think some of my listeners might be more familiar with this particular type of relationship of language.
right. Well, the first thing to notice about that question is that prehension does not become consciousness.
Hmm?
Prehension is a small form of consciousness.
There you go.
And that's what Whitehead called, that's the consciousness that goes all the way down. And that's important. Consciousness goes all the way down, all the way up. It's pan consciousness. And I don't like the term, like I said, panpsychism, because I think psyche is a little bit too complex a term to use for the consciousness of a photon or a quark or an electron. Um, so I prefer like pan-interiorism.
I love that term. When I read that, it was like, why hasn't someone used this term like 20 years ago? I mean,
Right,
everything between that, the pan-interiorism, and then where you're going to go, I'm going to invite you to go in terms of the new understanding of matter.
right.
Wow, did that hit my sweet spot?
And so wherever there's an exterior, there's an interior. It doesn't make sense to say, oh, I've got an exterior, but no interior. That doesn't even compute. So wherever there's an exterior, there's some degree of an interior. That's true in quarks, it's true in photons, it's true in electrons, it's true in protons, it's true of atoms, molecules, cells. Generally, it's taken that apprehension, which is actually a small form of consciousness. But if it's just felt as something different from consciousness, consciousness is generally said to occur with um, the earliest forms of animal life. So fish and on up into amphibians and then reptiles and then mammals. And then the real diehards don't see it arising until humans, but it's been around way longer than humans um, because interiors have been here since the beginning of the universe. As soon as any exterior blew into existence, it had an interior. There are no outsides without insides. It doesn't even make sense to talk about them.
Beautiful.
So that's sort of my retake on
So,
consciousness.
yeah, so just to put my understanding on it, so the matter then becomes not merely, in fact, it really supplants this, right? It supplants the old view in the great chain of being from the perennial philosophy that matter is the reduction base, right?
Right,
So complete revolution and transformation of the reduction base. And basically then, because it's such a central point, instead of having everything reduced to that, you basically, the sense of matter is now extended
right.
to include the exteriority of everything. So maybe
That's
say a
right.
little bit more about that, because then therefore, with every arising, there's a so-called material or exterior
Right,
expression and a
right.
correlative interior expression. So that to me is the real gift of this insight.
Sure. And that's why it is at least possible to think as if there's nothing but a materialistic world, because there's always matter being expanded into larger forms of consciousness. So, what's the most conscious thing we can think of? It's a human being. Well, what's a human being? Oh, it's just a material brain and a material body with material drives and material impulses. Well, the way I use the term matter, that's right, because matter is in the form of a brain. It's expanded to as enough area that its prehension is linguistic, is mathematical, is consciousness obvious. And so um, you can see how materialists can shake everything down into just matter as a nothingness, as an absence of awareness or consciousness. And then they have to come up with ways
Right?
to
It's a
make
hard problem.
matter jump and
Right.
leap into a conscious form, which is
Right.
just absolutely ridiculous.
Yeah, and that's
It
the
makes
that's
no
David
sense
Chalmers'
at
hard
all.
exactly. Yeah. So this is beautiful because what it does is that it really expands. And this is the just the great thing about your work, Ken, is that just the narrative of openness altogether along all these vectors is amazing. And for me, this radically expands my notion of what a materialist is. A materialist is an exteriorist. A
Right,
materialist is a superficialist. A
right,
materialist is one who's addicted, blinded by superficial appearances, who's stuck in the world of mere appearance. And
right,
this is why the wisdom traditions say we suffer because appearance is not in harmony with reality, which
right,
here means we suffer because the exteriors are not in harmony or resonance with the interiors.
right,
And so, like, holy moly, this like redefines the entire issue.
right,
And helps us look at it in a new way. So,
right.
anything more, you have anything more you have to say on this? I just thought I just chuckled when I read this. I thought it was such a great insight.
Yeah. And it does differ from the typical panpsychism, because I think again, psyche is much too in its full meaning, psyche means matter when it's become a brain. And in my version of it, that's exactly as it should be. But um, that's generally what a psyche means, is the form of consciousness that a brain is associated with as an exterior. The interior of the brain is the psyche. And I buy that understanding of psyche, but that's not, I mean, a quark doesn't have a brain. It doesn't have a very complex exterior. So its interior isn't that complex either. It's just a bit of prehension. And that prehension will grow and evolve into larger and larger exteriors until it produces amphibians, which have a clear sort of awareness, and reptiles, which have a clear sort of awareness, and mammals, which have even more clear forms of awareness, because their exteriors are getting more complex, and therefore their interiors are getting more complex. And all of that fits together. All of that makes a great deal of sense. And yet it's not the typical form of panpsychism.
Yeah.
So I'm sort of saved from.
No, I love it. And so let me see if this lands with you as well. I think what this also does to me, Ken, when I'm looking at the so-called cash value aspect of it, how does this apply to my life kind of thing? What I derive from this that is really quite beautiful is it's a type of empowerment. It's a type of empowerment in that it really invites and reveals the immediacy of what we would call spirituality. Because, in other words, if you look at the so-called material properly, in harmony, in other words, it's showing up in balance with the other quadrants, and in particular, the left, now all of a sudden matter is not set merely in opposition um, to spirituality, which, depending on how you define it, you could equate mostly with left-hand quadrants, right?
Right,
There's some qualifications there. But to me, what it does is, well, hold a second. Now we've got a real marriage. We've got a real unity of inner and outer of spirit and matter. Because if you
right,
relate to matter properly, just look a little bit closer, look inside, and you'll see that spirit is actually the so-called balancing aspect of matter. And
right,
so therefore this changes everything. Instead of like our mutual friend Alma says, when people set out on the spiritual path, they're unwittingly setting out for heaven because they feel like matter is perverse. I have to FedEx my consciousness out of this dimension into some
right,
spiritual realm. Well, this is a true non-theistic trajectory that you're talking about. No, you don't have to do that. This is real non-theism. This means you simply have to open the aperture of your awareness, look at the exteriors properly, almost with like an X-ray vision, right? The superior vision of the Taoist, and realize, hey, wait a second. This pen that I'm holding right now is spirit.
right,
It's only when I get glued to the superficial appearance of it, get blinded
right,
by the display. Our mutual friend Trungpa Rinpoche said this. We lose the essence in the display. That's one definition of samsara. So the display, when it's reified, becomes so-called matter. when you look at it closely in a spiritual lens, you rediscover the essence. So I know this is a big dump, but it's only because this was such an insight that I grooved on that I get a little carried away with it.
Yeah, that's great.
But the empowerment of the immediacy, just look closely and into that which you previously thought was anti-meditative, anti-spiritual, you will find the interiority, you'll find the spirit even in the matter. And
Right.
that's a small thing.
And that goes for rocks. I mean, of course, God exists in rocks. I mean, where else is he supposed to be?
Yeah, this is a really elegant way to bring some traction to sacred world, sacred outlook,
Right.
to realize that the panentheist approach, the divinity is embedded, it's immanent and transcendent. And so I don't know, I just found it such a wonderful, wonderful insight. So
Uh, that's great.
huge, huge. Thank you for that. So I want to transition because I really want to respect your time. But I mean, we could talk about this book canon forever. There's so much richness here. But I want to maybe transition a little bit because you are so uniquely situated as a lifelong scholar, as a scholar practitioner. I mean, your ability to act as a yogi and a practitioner and a scholar is almost without peer. And so you're uniquely situated to talk about a couple things. And so, not necessarily in order of importance, because I have several here, is a kind of a State of the Union address from you about the transplantation or revelation of authentic truth and Dharma in the West. Because as part of your integral approach, you dance so fluidly between so-called Eastern and Western approaches. What do you see? Now, okay, we're going to go up to the 50,000 foot perspective here because so much of your work, you even define evolution largely as increase in perspective. Let's zoom out and look at things from a trans global perspective,
Yeah.
and tell me what you see on a couple fronts. The State of the Union of the transplantation of Dharma, not necessarily Buddha Dharma, just Dharma, truth in the West. What you see there that may excite you, what you see here that concerns you. How effective are we being as not merely liturgical translators, but cultural translators, bringing the ancient wisdom of the East into the modern milieu of the West? What's the state of the union there?
Yeah. Well, there are a couple things about that. What is sort of unmistakable is starting in the 60s, there was the so-called psychedelic decade. And that's where almost a ton of particularly baby boomers started doing mescaline, LSD, psilocybin. And as many very good philosophers have demonstrated, they've even written books on it, like Aldous Huxley and Alan Watts. They have taken psychedelics. And we also have a lot of actual research that's being done at Princeton and other very reputable colleges and universities, is that psychedelics do have a very real capacity to bring about psychedelic states, which are usually various forms of mystical experiences. And I mean, even Richard Alpert and uh, became Ram Dass and so on. Um, but they would take it and give it to their theological students. And some 70% of the theological students would have what they would themselves would describe as their first ever truly mystical experience. And so the 60s sort of opened up the West, particularly America, Britain, Europe, to psychedelic mystical experiences. And I myself didn't do that many psychedelics. I tried LSD maybe 2 or 3 times, but I didn't try mescaline or psilocybin or any of the others. Um, but I was very happy to see that there were creating genuinely mystical experiences. And this became obvious to me as I read the books of those philosophers who had taken psychedelics and had genuinely mystical experiences and wrote about it, as Alan Watts did and Aldous Huxley and so on. And I was infuriated when the government outlawed all of them, because all of a sudden we had an explosion of mystical consciousness. And then it was just wiped off the face of the planet. And it really upset me. Even though I wasn't doing that much of it myself, I saw the benefit of what it was doing for the country and opening up people. And you remember how psychedelic the early 60s were. I mean, we had psychedelic art and psychedelic movies, and I mean, it was just everywhere. And I thought it was fantastic. And then the government outlawed all of it, and that really upset me. And what has continued to upset me, even though it's starting to come back, universities like Princeton are starting to do actual research with students and professors taking psychedelics and having mystical experiences. And they're actually recording all of this. And it's just unmistakable that they're having genuine mystical experiences. Um, but what bothered me during that interim period from the 60s to the 2020s was that we were we kind of forgot the waking up aspects of religion. And it tended to go back to mythic, literal Christianity. And that has always bothered me because it's just tooth fairy stuff. It's mythic, literal realities. And that seemed to happen in a fairly widespread way. But now, as mystical psychedelic experiences are being explored in the major universities, people have increasingly sort of let go of the mythic, literal approach to waking up. As I said, 11% of Europeans buy Christianity. So I'm hopeful that that will continue and that we will get a genuinely mystical waking up version of religion, and it will start to sort of come back. And that would be great, I think.
And is there,
And
oh, I'm sorry. Is there, there's often on this topic, I'm often traffic, someone in conjunction with a slightly debunked 100th monkey thing. In the really compelling work of the early work of Rupert Sheldrake and now Michael Levin about punctuated equilibrium, tipping points. This is a really interesting question for me to throw into your court as a really sophisticated developmentalist and structuralist. Is this kind of Aquarian age, oh, if we just get enough people at a certain dimension, there's going to be this osmotic transformation and we're going to save ourselves from this impending catastrophe. I'm agnostic on this. I don't know enough, but this is one of the things that you're uniquely qualified. When I look at your life, Ken, it's this two major gifts. One is this extraordinary gift of perspective, and deeply connected to that is the gift of pattern recognition, the capacity to just literally see things that other people don't see. And that is, in fact, pattern recognition is brought about by perspective. So the set of questions I want to ask you along this line is just that. So is this a false hope that if there's enough groundswell, there comes a point where these stages we go into this, we haven't mentioned these terms, but turquoise or second tier. How likely is that? Or does evolution, it's like a tide. Evolution advances and recedes and advances and recede. So talk to us a little bit about how do we have any hope? I guess that's
Yeah.
another way to talk about it, right? Are we going to save ourselves from ourselves in time using a developmental approach?
Well, if we actually use the developmental approach, it might indeed have a real effect. But the problem is, waking up is very different from growing up.
There we go again. Yep.
Wake up all over the place and still be at a magic or mythic stage of growing up. One doesn't produce the other. And so I don't look at what's being done at Princeton University or anything as doing virtually anything to help with actual growing up. They're not checking growing up stages when people are having all these waking up experiences. They're not saying, oh, and they're at the mythic or the rational, the pluralistic stage of growing up. Nobody's checking that at all.
Yeah.
Almost all professors, almost all human beings are completely unaware of the process of growing up, let alone the actual stages of growing up. So I don't see that having that much of an impact. And as for growing up stages themselves, we have people at the rational stage. There's maybe 30 to 40% of people at the rational stage. At the green pluralistic stage, there's about 23% of the population at green. And at the teal, beginning integral stages, there's 5 to 7%.
Yeah.
And at turquoise, the highest integral stage, there's 0.5% of the population at turquoise. That's nothing. That's pathetic. And I don't see anybody working on increasing that level of growing up. And that there's only 0.5% of the population that can actually understand the fullness of growing up and what it means and how it comes about. And only 0.5% can even think along those lines. That's very discouraging. And I don't see that changing very rapidly.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the trickle down effect, there's not a lot to trickle down, right? If there's such a small population pool. So again, looking into your crystal ball, and these are impossible questions, but looking into your crystal ball with your capacity for pattern recognition, I don't want to get into prognostication too dramatically here, but what patterns do you see? So we're intimating some things. The likelihood of the Anthropocene really being the end of it all. How much hope do we have based on your research, also your experience in terms of where things are going? How optimistic are you when you look at the meta crisis that's taking place and the ability of a meta theory to actually work to do something about it?
Yeah. I'm actually, even though I've sort of been talking pessimistically about only 0.5%, I'm actually fairly optimistic that evolution, because it is a very real force in the real world, it will continue operating. And so we will continue to evolve or grow up. So that 5 to 7 at teal is all on the verge of being able to move and drive turquoise levels higher. And it wouldn't surprise me if within 10 to 20 years that most of that 5 to 7% had moved into turquoise.
Hmm.
And when that happens, that'll be really great. And usually what happens is when the leading edge reaches 10%, there's a major transformative effect on all of culture. So when 10% moved into magic, we developed shamanic religions and tribal inclusive awareness. And then when 10% reached mythic, we had almost all of the world's great religions were founded, Christianity, Hinduism, Buddhism. Those all came starting around 10,000 BCE when the mythic stage started to emerge. And the more people at a mythic stage, the more people actually got into stages of waking up. And then when we got rational stage, the Western Enlightenment broke out, and we had the founding of virtually all of the world's major sciences, all came into existence. Well, according to one major historian, modern science was simultaneously and independently invented by Kepler and Galileo. They both, in 1605, came up with the notion that, quote, the laws of nature are to best be understood through measurement.
Yeah.
And Kepler measured planetary motions
Birth
and
of the
came up with
Enlightenment.
his laws of planetary motion. Galileo measured terrestrial motion, came up with his laws of earthly motion. And the super genius Isaac Newton put both of them together and came up with his universal laws of gravity, which meant that the thing that makes an apple fall from a tree is the same thing that makes the moon go around the earth, which is gravity.
Yeah.
So when 10% of the population reaches heal, we will have the genuine beginning of a truly integral culture.
Yeah.
And that will be an amazing event. And that could happen in 10 to 20 years.
Oh, nice.
And then it'll, of course, increase its integrative capacity when 10% reaches turquoise.
Yeah.
So, but I see teal, I see some real breakthroughs occurring in teal, which is the first stage of the second tier or truly integral stages of development. And I see that happening within 10 to 20 years.
And so can you speculate, or do you have a sense of what brings about this type of tipping point? I mean, I think of things like quantum field theory, quantum entanglement, even just metaphorically. I can't speak with any authority here, but what is the mechanism for this kind of transformation that takes place at this magical 10% mark? Do you have a sense of what's actually taking place that brings about these types of tectonic shifts?
Well, they're often in the modern world, they often occur with major scientific breakthroughs.
Hmm.
And so in particular, we think of Einstein and relativity theory, and then we think of Darwin and evolutionary theory.
Hmm.
And those became such powerfully influential scientific breakthroughs that the terminology got adopted almost by all of culture.
Hmm.
So within 10 years of Einstein's relativity breakthrough, almost the entire culture was talking relativity, although it was a strange misunderstanding of what Einstein was actually saying, because Einstein wasn't saying everything is relative to everything else. He was actually toyed with calling his theory absolutism, because he was talking about the absolute universality of space-time unfolding. But everybody took relativity as being relative. And so we got that became a part of how modern reality was interpreted. It's all relative. And that's the understanding that but it took from Einstein's discoveries and the names that he gave it, which everybody adopted. Um, and as far as evolution, within 10 to 20 years of Darwin's discoveries, everybody was adopting an evolutionary mentality. Um, Darwin's actual evolutionary theory, it's common to hear evolutionary biologists say that everybody, every major scientist accepts evolutionary theory. And you'll hear them say this all the time. But there are actually two components to evolutionary theory. There's the what of evolution, and there's the why. The part that everybody agrees with is the what of evolution, namely the order that animal and plant species evolved. That's the what of evolution. And everybody accepts that we went from single-celled cells to multicellular organism, starting with plants and then amphibians and then fish and then reptiles and then mammals and then humans. Virtually all scientists accept that order of evolution. And that's what they mean when they say everybody agrees with evolution. But the why of evolution, there's very little major agreement between all scientists on why does evolution occur. And the main problem is that the standard Darwinian explanation of why evolution occurs is simply wrong. It doesn't work. It can't nearly explain the probabilistic likelihood. Well, for example, to produce a single horse takes 10 to the 30 zeros probability. And there's no way that Darwin could explain that probability. And he didn't even try. And moreover, he was aware that he hadn't done it and said so. So, and that's why we're seeing a lot of breakthroughs occurring, which essentially add a fourth or a fifth force to existence. And it's called self-organization. So people like Stuart Kaufman of the famous Santa Fe Institute says that evolution is produced by natural selection plus self-organization.
Yeah.
And self-organization is what I call eros. It's a major drive of evolution. It produces molecules out of atoms and produces cells out of molecules and produces multicellular organisms out of single-celled beings and so on. And that's a very recent discovery. It's only 10 or 15 years old, but you're seeing all sorts of books by evolutionary theorists talking about this new drive that they see operating alongside natural selection.
Yeah.
Natural selection can account for very minor
Yeah.
forms of mutation that have a like 10 to the 20
Like,
chance of happening, but not 10 to the 300
right.
power. It can't come near to explaining that. But self-driving,
Yeah.
self-organizing forces can.
So what does this, how does this self-organization relate to our mutual old friend Francesco Varela's seminal introduction of autopoiesis? So is Francesco's work subsumed under Kaufman's work of self-organization? So this is such an incredibly important, impactful topic. How does this reconcile with what Francesco was introducing that in so many ways was like a seminal idea back with his work?
Yeah, and he was working with the same drive. He came up, he and Francisco
Maturana. Yeah.
came up with the idea that every living cell has a autopoietic drive. And autopoietic means self-making
Mm.
or self-driving. So it's a self-organizing drive. And that's why cells get more and more complex. And even the first living cell, and the reason that Darwin did not explain its existence is, I mean, when cells were first discovered, they were thought of as simple blobs of protoplasm. But even the simplest single cell has an enormous number of actual self machines that are incredibly sophisticated and are the product of 30 or 40 major mutations. And it's just staggering what a single cell contains. All of the organelles, all of the self machines, all of the flagellations. I mean, the flagellum
Yeah.
on a single cell is an enormously complex machine. It has 40 or 50 major parts, all of which take 2 to 3 mutations to occur. And it's staggering what it's being produced. And so Francisco was working on an autopoietic drive
Mm.
that would help account for
Yeah.
that. And
Yeah.
that's the same as a self-organizing
Deeply
drive.
connected to what Kaufman's talking about. And so inherent in all of this, this is, I wouldn't say it's the elephant in the room, but inherent in all this is telos, teleology. Is there, you mentioned earlier Chardin's, you didn't mention his name, but Alpha and Omega. Is there an Omega, or is it just Leela? Is it just this play of it all? I mean, when you look again with this marvelous pattern recognition perspective, where does teleology play into evolution?
Yeah. Well, there's two different types of teleology. The original teleology, which is the drive to self-organization, has a random component. And it is just a bit Leela. It is the play of Brahman. But every time a new ingredient comes into existence through telos, it is repeated.
Yeah, like a
And
fractal.
that is a fixed telos,
Mm.
because once archaic came into existence, every subsequent living organism went through an archaic stage, the same basic archaic stage. And then the leading edge telos, or the playful telos, produced magic out of archaic. And that was a random, devil may care, playful
Mm.
emergence.
Mm.
An emergent means something new comes out of nothing, basically, or it's coming out of the previous stage that developed. But then once magic is in place, it exists. And all of a sudden, every organism had to go from archaic to magic. And then they could sort of play at the leading edge and sort of self-produce a new stage, which was called mythic.
Mm.
And that playful telos then became part of a fixed telos. And the mythic stage had to emerge. It was fixed. It was still driven by a telos, or a self-organizing drive, would self-organize from magic into mythic. But then at the leading edge of that, it was just wide open, and almost anything could appear. And what appeared was a rational stage of development through the playful telos of self-organizing playfulness. But once rational emerged, it became part of a fixed telos. And
Okay.
that meant that every animal born at the archaic stage was actually aiming for the rational stage. and it had to go from archaic to magic to mythic to rational in a teleologically driven,
Yeah, yeah.
fixed way. And then when it got to rational, it could start to play again. And it did. And then it produced a pluralistic stage. And that became part of
Yeah.
the fixed teleology.
Yeah, it's fantastic. Oh my gosh, there's so much here. So this may be a tiny bit unfair to listeners, but I'm going to go for it anyway because if they're intrigued, they can do the homework and realize, wow, this is some rich stuff. So what I'm playing with here is this kind of notion. What out contextualizes what? What is the supreme explanatory mandala or container here? I mean, on one level, of course, integral that's the great gift of integral. In a certain way, this is just my silly languaging. It seems to out contextualize everything because it includes everything. It has so much tremendous explanatory power. But and this is the part that might be a little bit unfair to my listeners, and so apologies. Where is the place of involution and evolution here? Because on one level, this is the blind side to our listeners, is on one level, this is such a seminal way of understanding the play of the whole shebang, is the involutionary drive into play, the play of spirit in and as form, getting excessively involved as form. With this, it's so interesting in terms of the languaging. And then the return back being the evolutionary drive, basically the unfolding of the involutionary givens. So talk to us a little bit about the relationship of evolution as original unfolding versus evolution as remembrance. Plato talked about it as anamnesis. In a certain way, the essence of
Right.
spiritual practice is remembrance. So on one level, evolution seems to be the process of remembering, literally remembering, reuniting to the transpersonal non-dual. But on another level, we have this marvelous exposition from Plotinus in your work of the expression of these involutionary givens as they play out. Does this make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Because I
The first involutionary givens are largely the product of a playful telos. It is the Leela of Brahman. Brahman playfully throwing
shine.
itself outward. And as it does so, it steps down into denser and denser forms. But these forms are uh, not themselves fixed or given ahead of time.
Like empty forms, archetypes.
That's right. It's still out of nothingness that these forms are emerging. And as they emerge, they take on a generalized form.
Mm.
And that generalized form will become fixed and set. And so once it gets down, once it throws itself out as far as it can, in other words, to the lowest form of prehension it can find, and it'll sort
Right.
of come to a stop,
Yeah.
and then it tends to reverse and
So wait,
evolve.
very briefly. So this, pardon the interjection, because if I don't throw it in, I'll forget. Now, this would be the Big Bang. This would be matter as we know it in the kind of the physical sense, matter as a reductionist sense, right? So we can kind of
Yep,
sweep that back in. Okay. I
yep.
mean to throw you off rails, but I wanted to make sure we threw that in.
And so what we have held in the ground unconscious are all these generalized forms that
Mm.
we would call soul, mind, body, and matter. And those are the generalized forms that telos will follow as
Mm.
it returns to spirit.
Cool.
So, and the reason that that forms a telos is once you have gone from matter to body, then as the body continues to be pushed from within to grow and evolve, it can only adopt the next higher form, which would be a mind. And so the form of the mind itself isn't fixed. I mean, it doesn't emerge as a form of pantheism or a form of idealism or a form of materialism. but it is forced into a broad mental form. And in other words, what mind means, it uses symbols and thoughts and so on. And so that was part of the form that was created in involution.
Say that last part again, Ken. I'm sorry. The last thing.
The form of symbols and
Mhm.
mind, and maybe even the general form of mathematics, these were the forms that were created in involution
Yeah. Yep.
and are still awaiting and exerting a pull to create the telos, the playful telos that's pulling it back. And then when mind emerges and goes through its forms and exhausts all of those, then that becomes part of a fixed telos.
Mm.
And so everything born after the mind emerges will be drawn to that mental form.
So
And once
this is again, I have to
it's there, it is open to evolve into forms of soul.
So when you say mind here, the languaging here is important to me because when you say mind on one level, I think I have to be a little careful because on one level, in an idealistic sense, it's all mind. So are you talking about mind in this instance as a meta consciousness? When you say mind evolving at this point, would that be analogous to actually meta consciousness? Because it seems to me mind in consciousness are that's what seems to me out contextualizes or embraces everything, right? The play of spirit, the play of mind, the play of consciousness. So when you're talking about mind now, you're talking about, to me, what I flap on,
Small mind,
small
small
mind.
mind, not big mind.
Got it. Okay.
Okay.
Yeah. Got it. Yeah. And again, I hate to keep interrupting you, but the points are
That's
so
okay.
rich if I don't throw them in. So continue the evolutionary dance. So we go from matter to mind to soul, and then there's this evolutionary return.
And that's right. And so from soul, a soul is going to reproduce the general forms of soul that were produced during involution. And it'll fill them out, of course, with all the things that soul experiences or feels or the type of thoughts it has or whatever is in what we mean by soul when we talk about somebody who awakens their soul. They're awakening to this broad openness of possibilities that transcends the mind because it's matter, body, mind, soul, spirit.
Mhm.
And so it transcends mind and fills itself out with all of these meta mind forms. Okay. And that's what somebody who wakes up to their soul will experience, a beginning transcendental component of themselves that goes beyond their mind and their ego and their small self and their small mind. And that's why soul is a very spiritual discovery. And it'll get pulled up into soul. And then as it goes through soul and exhausts the forms of soul that are available to it, that is, exhaust the forms of soul that were laid down in involution, then it's open to move into spirit. And it will playfully move into spirit and start to fill up the forms that are offered at the spiritual level. And these were forms that were laid down as spirit was first involving.
Yeah. Remarkable. And so here's the thing so we throw our lifeline to our listeners, is this is to me is like what Bateson talked about as a meta pattern, or in chaos and complexity language, universality, self-similarity. It's fractal in nature. So the reason I say this is how how can we take this particular marvelous explanatory process and bring it into immediate application with the arising of every moment, right? So we have this wonderful cosmological expression. We could say arguably us coming into life at birth is an iteration of this on another level. and then really moment to moment. I love this get rid of the noun creation and replace it with creating, because
Right.
creation seems to apply, oh geez, I'm stuck in this thing and I have no power. So if we replace creation with creating, then we realize we have the capacity to work with this process that can seem like, oh God, I'm screwed. I'm still stuck in this big kind of play of the cosmos that began way back when, and here I am, this hapless thing. Well, I think, again, in the spirit of empowerment, when we were talking about earlier in relation to materialism, the same thing applies here. How does this apply, this phenomenology apply to right now? I mean, how is this evolutionary recycling process taking place in the moment-to-moment arising of our own world?
Sure. Um, the fundamental drive of evolutionary force is to transcend and include. And that is the actual dynamic of moment to moment experience. Notice Alfred North Whitehead said that the subject of one moment becomes the object of the subject of the next moment.
Fantastic. Yep.
And which is brilliant. I mean, it means that as a new subject arises in this moment, it is aware of my previous subject and now sees it as an object. And this new subject is new. I haven't experienced that part before, but I've experienced the previous part. So in some ways it's new, it transcends it, but it also includes. It includes everything in the past. And that's how the universe keeps showing up in new and novel ways. And that's why every moment of our existence is new,
Canvas.
partially new. And so that's what's happening. And that transcend and include will have some teleological elements in it, as we described.
Yeah, and why isn't this model more discussed and more unpacked? Because when I first came across it in your work, and then Plotinus and I think Aurobindo, I was floored. It had so much explanatory power. It's just
Right.
click, 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 click. Why hasn't this taken on more traction in the academic, even philosophical arena? Do you see any reasons why it isn't more commonplace? Because it has so much power.
Um, I, you know, I could ask that question of hundreds of different topics
Yeah.
because if you look at most of the integral framework of quadrants, levels, lines, states, and types, almost no professors are aware of quadrants or levels or states or levels, lines, or types. I
Yeah.
mean, they just aren't. And I go, well, why aren't they? Because they're so important. How could so many college professors not know the levels of growing up? How
Yeah.
could they be so stupid? It, I mean, it takes a village to raise a child, but it also takes an entire village to bring up a complete idiot. And we have a idiot producing village. It's astonishing to me. Across the board, we're producing idiots. And I've never understood
Yeah.
why that was the case.
Yeah, to me,
Every quote discovery that I've made shocked the daylights out of me. I had no idea we had growing up stages. I had no idea that every line went through certain number of levels. And
yeah,
I knew nothing about states of consciousness and a waking up experience or an enlightenment experience. All of those were new to
yeah,
me.
yeah.
And I sort of knew that we all had first person, second person, third person, fourth person perspectives, but I had no idea that they formed quadrants and the quadrants themselves went all the way up, all the way down. So I've been scratching my head.
That's
Every
amazing.
discovery I made just blew me
That's
away.
it's amazing to me as well. And so as we slowly start to wind up, because otherwise, dear friend, I could talk to you until we reach the omega point. is what is the again, these are ridiculous questions, but they're worth throwing into your court. What is the single most important unanswered question for you? I mean, what would be like you get either, whatever in a dream and transmission is like, oh, that's finally answered for me. What is still it's still within your heart mind matrix that's longing for resolution or clarity or articulation?
How many more areas of wholeness are there?
Oh, well, well,
I've come up with five, but I'm sure there are some other types out there, and I can sort of make up ones. But the thing about finding some theoretical something or other that you're going to propose exists is it's really hard to find, like if you have, let's say, 8 levels of development, it's really hard to find 8 different names that will describe these 8 levels.
mm,
But you've got to call them something. So what do you call them? And it's very, very difficult to come up with those names. Um, and so it's like I'm always running some new growing up, waking up, showing up, opening up, cleaning up through my mind. But not many of them stick in a real way. So that's what I'm always thinking
always.
about. So,
And somewhat connected to this, but this now expands beyond you to include the integral movement. What do you see as the biggest challenge facing integral going forward?
well, what's the next form of
Yeah,
integral?
exactly.
Um, and there are hundreds of philosophers and professors and thinkers that are using an integral framework now that have adopted my 5 major components. And all of them are working on what's the next form of integral. So there's plenty of people working on this topic. Um, but so far, I haven't seen one that works. Um, and I think they would jump out and become fairly well known if they did, simply because so many people are working on this model.
Yeah,
But so far there hasn't been anything. So
yeah,
they're still looking. We're all looking.
yeah. I mean, that's part of the life will never ending dance, right? I mean, I think coming back very briefly to the telos and the omega thing,
Right?
the notion, there even in the evolutionary schema, there seems to be, oh, like the fruition is to return to the formless, to the Godhead or what. And I think this is again kind of what we are talking about at the outset. This absolutistic problem with a non-dual people. You're just going to return to whatever emptiness. And I think that's a colossal escapist approach. I think it's classical spiritual bypassing. So to me, it's like that the journey is the goal, right? Just engaging in the play and residing in what Varela talked about as the power of the open question and being okay with that. And right, Dalavananda, Dafrijan, divine ignorance, the capacity to rest in the not knowing mind and actually be okay with that. There's something quite elegant and beautiful about that, right? The play of the search for articulation and clarity and understanding and patterns like you do, and also at the same time at the end of one's life or at the end of even every day, just saying the utter freedom of just saying, I don't know, and how beautiful that is, and just being
Yeah.
open to creating that field of openness.
And that is today the end point of integral. It's
Mm,
already the end point of integral.
mm, yeah, yeah, that's really, really, really great. So, again, in closing, as you reflect over this remarkable life, I mean, the stuff that you've experienced, what you've gone through, what you've produced, the gifts, how can we, integral life practice, we've intimated that, we haven't really pinged it, integrating, how do we take this? We've spent 2 hours talking about such an amazing array of topics, but let's bring heaven back down to earth in two ways and work with the I and the we space. How can we take these amazing teachings in the context of, what comes to my mind, of course, is integral life practice, to really take this stuff and not just leave it at the level of the map. The big problem today, right, Ken, in this information age, is we confuse information for experience. And we can have as much information as possible, but if it stays up here, it's not going to transform us. It's going to transform us when we wake down into our soma. So two questions. We've sort of intimated these, or you have, but maybe bullet point to close. How can we take this amazing body of knowledge, bring it into I space, best thing we can do for ourselves, and then we space? How do we take it to help this world? Because I close every one of my riffs these days that if what I'm doing with my stuff is not a benefit to the world, it's irrelevant. It's irrelevant. So the relevancy is transformation at the level of I, and then we space. So maybe a little bit of some statements about those two.
Well, with an I space, if you want to behave differently, you have to think differently. So the first step is to really look at the integral framework and to learn it in a general sense. What are your stages of growing up? How many multiple intelligences do you have? And multiple intelligences, you can, the multiple intelligence was the last area that I introduced. And the way I really got a sense of them is I laid out about a dozen multiple intelligences, and then I took each one of them, and for an entire day of each week, I would work with just one multiple intelligence. And the first one I tried was beauty or aesthetic intelligence. And it blew my mind. I just started looking for beauty in the world. And at first I could just see things that stood out as beautiful, but then more and more things started appearing beautiful. And this whole world just became this overwhelming source of gorgeous beauty. And I was just floored by it. How did I not notice this before? Because I wasn't opening up to my multiple intelligences.
Oh,
And
fantastic.
then I did moral intelligence, and sort of the same thing happened. I was like, well, how I'm seeing this as a person I should be moral towards. So how does that actually manifest itself in my case? And I would come up with, well, treat the person fairly, treat them kindly, and so on. And so the first thing you want to do is, in a sense, learn the basic framework. And so you know what you have that you need to convert into your behavior, and then just go through them.
Yeah.
And you can, I'm sorry there isn't a faster way, but there isn't. You have to take them one at a time and actually apply them and do them one at a time, one each day, if you want to do it that way. But you will find that you can learn how to think differently. And the more you think differently, the more you'll start to act differently.
Yeah. It's
And
like,
then,
oh, I'm sorry, please continue.
well, I should say, and then once you've done that with your I, simply start talking with other people about it and say, you can just actually pick somebody that you're used to having fairly intellectual conversations with and say, I want to introduce you to this way of thinking, and I want to see what you think about it. And then just pick whatever you want, start with the quadrants, and then go to levels, uh, of growing up, and then you can talk about waking up. And generally, most people that are introduced to the integral framework will find it so new for just all the reasons we've explained. We've raised a village of cultural idiots, and nobody knows about any of this stuff. And so most people are actually quite interested when they find that there is this framework that sort of holds everything together. And so you can actually get some very good conversations going on a we basis.
Yeah.
And they're quite fun.
This is so amazingly rich because, again, what I think of here, Ken, back to what we were talking about a few minutes ago in terms of like, how do we take the involutionary, evolutionary, metaphysical thing and make it immediate? The way I look at this in terms of the power of thought, because, especially, in the spiritual community, thought is the enemy. I mean, it's almost anti-intellectual. It's the most
Yeah,
ridiculous sort of thing. And so when I look at this, I see it as if as Eros is shining through me, it's going to make its first instantiation through the contents of my own mind. And so therefore, if I change the way I think, then as the light shines through me, the light of Ein Sof, the light of the Dharma, the light of Vajrasattva, it doesn't matter. It's going to come through these primordial first forms, which in this case would be the forms of my own mind.
yeah,
And through those forms, like the Pali Canon says so beautifully, the mind leads all things. Well, let's take this and make it very immediate. So now the way you think, like Baba said this, change the way you think about things, you're going to change the way you see things. And
right,
so this facile, not facile, but this ready to dismiss power of thought to really change. This is like tulku practice for me. It's like voluntarily shaping my formless mind into first forms of thought, from which then thought is subtle, but it's not ineffectual. It's the
right,
most effectual thing we have. And so this is the power of authentic philosophy, the power of authentic rigorous thinking, using in a truly Socratic Platonic way, the power of the mind in this regard to shape the way your mind forms, and then to shape the way your entire life forms, and then by extension, as it opens wider, into others. And so the whole idea for me, we were talking about earlier about psychoactive substances. Well, I think psychoactive in the deepest sense here is that literally psychoactive in terms of transformation of the psyche takes place right here with the power of right view. I mean, the first and foremost of the Eightfold Noble Path is right view. And
right.
so when I read your stuff, I go, my God, this is as right a view as I have ever come across. And so it's like my Buddhist friends who go, who needs this Wilber stuff, whatever. I go, dude, I mean, he's talking about right view in the most comprehensive, systemic way possible. And then there's a reason it's the first of the eight, because if you have this, mind leads all things, it becomes psychoactive. The view itself starts to change you from the inside.
Right.
What do you think?
I agree. And to answer the question when they say, who needs this Wilber stuff? The answer is you do. And I'll tell you at least 5 ways that
Yeah,
you need it. And you're only following one of them, which is waking up.
yeah,
And there are 4 others that are
yeah.
just as important.
And then people wonder why something's missing, right? I mean,
Right.
it's just amazing. Ken, I love you, my friend. You've been one of the great influences in my life. Every time I talk to you, I learn so much. Every time I gobble up on your books, it's like I am so blessed to have you both as an intellectual mentor, friend, compatriot along the spiritual path as well. It's really been one of the great delights of my life. And
Great.
so so fun to hang with you. Thanks for straying a little bit off this magnificent book to look at some of these other topics, but
Sure.
I just out myself. We had to run there.
Well, it's been a pleasure. Thank you.
All the best to you, and I'll see you at the event coming up this week.
Okay. Bye
Take
bye.
care. See ya.